thevoicebefore-the-void.net. What I Saw of Shiloh by Ambrose Bierce. Part 1. Read by The Voice Before the Void. 1. This is a simple story of a battle. Such a tale as may be told by a soldier who is no writer, to a reader who is no soldier. The morning of Sunday, the 6th day of April, 1862, was bright and warm. Reveille had been sounded rather late, for the troops, wearied with long marching, were to have a day of rest. The men were idling about the embers of their bivouac fires, some preparing breakfast, others looking carelessly to the condition of their arms and accoutrements, against the inevitable inspection. Still others were chatting with indolent dogmatism on that never-failing theme, the end and object of the campaign. Sentinels paced up and down the confused line with a lounging freedom of mien and stride that would not have been tolerated at another time. A few of them limped unsoldierly in deference to blistered feet. At a little distance in rear of the stacked arms were a few tents, out of which frowsy-headed officers occasionally peered, languidly calling to their servants to fetch a basin of water, dust a coat, or polish a scabbard. Trim young mounted orderlies, bearing dispatches obviously unimportant, urged their lazy nags by devious ways amongst the men, enduring with unconcern their good-humored raillery, the penalty of superior station. Little negroes of not very clearly defined status and function lolled on their stomachs, kicking their long bare heels in the sunshine, or slumbered peacefully, unaware of the practical waggery prepared by white hands for their undoing. Presently the flag, hanging limp and lifeless at headquarters, was seen to lift itself spiritedly from the staff. At the same instant was heard a dull, distant sound like the heavy breathing of some great animal below the horizon. The flag had lifted its head to listen. There was a momentary lull in the hum of the human swarm. Then, as the flag drooped, the hush passed away. But there were some hundreds more men on their feet than before, some thousands of hearts beating with a quicker pulse. Again the flag made a warning sign, and again the breeze bore to our ears the long, deep sighing of iron lungs. The division, as if it had received the sharp word of command, sprang to its feet, and stood in groups at attention. Even the little blacks got up. I have since seen similar effects produced by earthquakes. I am not sure but the ground was trembling then. The mess cooks, wise in their generation, lifted the steaming camp kettles off the fire and stood by to cast out. The mounted orderlies had somehow disappeared. Officers came ducking from beneath their tents and gathered in groups. Headquarters had become a swarming hive. The sound of the great guns now came in regular throbbings, the strong, full pulse of the fever of battle. The flag flapped excitedly, shaking out its blazonry of stars and stripes with a sort of fierce delight. Toward the knot of officers in its shadow dashed from somewhere, he seemed to have burst out of the ground in a cloud of dust, a mounted aide-de-camp, and on the instant rose the sharp, clear notes of a bugle, caught up and repeated, and passed on by other bugles, until the level reaches of brown fields, the line of woods trending away to far hills, and the unseen valleys beyond were telling of the sound. The farther, fainter strains half drowned in ringing cheers as the men ran to range themselves behind the stacks of arms. For this call was not the wearisome general before which the tents go down. It was the exhilarating assembly, which goes to the heart as wine, and stirs the blood like the kisses of a beautiful woman. Who that has heard it calling to him above the grumble of great guns can forget the wild intoxication of its music? 2. The Confederate forces in Kentucky and Tennessee had suffered a series of reverses, culminating in the loss of Nashville. The blow was severe. Immense quantities of war material had fallen to the victor, together with all the important strategic points. General Johnston withdrew Beauregard's army to Corinth in northern Mississippi, where he hoped so to recruit and equip it as to enable it to assume the offensive and retake the lost territory. The town of Corinth was a wretched place, the capital of a swamp. It is a 2 days' march west of the Tennessee River, which here and for 150 miles farther, to where it falls into the Ohio at Paducah, runs nearly north. It is navigable to this point, that is to say, to Pittsburgh Landing, where Corinth got to it by a road worn through a thickly wooded country seamed with ravines and bayous, rising nobody knows where, and running into the river under sylvan arches heavily draped with Spanish moss. In some places they were obstructed by fallen trees. The Corinth Road was at certain seasons a branch of the Tennessee River. Its mouth was Pittsburgh Landing. Here, in 1862, were some fields and a house or two. Now there are a national cemetery and other improvements. It was at Pittsburgh Landing that Grant established his army, with a river in his rear and 2 toy steamboats as a means of communication with the east side, whither General Buell, with 30,000 men, was moving from Nashville to join him. The question has been asked, why did General Grant occupy the enemy's side of the river in the face of a superior force before the arrival of Buell? Buell had a long way to come. Perhaps Grant was weary of waiting. Certainly Johnston was, for in the gray of the morning of April 6th, when Buell's leading division was on bivouac near the little town of Savannah, 8 or 10 miles below, the Confederate forces, having moved out of Corinth 2 days before, fell upon Grant's advance brigades and destroyed them. Grant was at Savannah, but hastened to the landing in time to find his camps in the hands of the enemy, and the remnants of his beaten army cooped up with an impassable river at their backs for moral support. I have related how the news of this affair came to us at Savannah. It came on the wind, a messenger that does not bear copious details. 3. On the side of the Tennessee River, over against Pittsburgh Landing, are some low, bare hills, partly enclosed by a forest. In the dusk of the evening of April 6th, this open space, as seen from the other side of the stream, whence indeed it was anxiously watched by thousands of eyes, to many of which it grew dark long before the sun went down, would have appeared to have been ruled in long, dark lines, with new lines being constantly drawn across. These lines were the regiments of Buell's leading division, which, having moved up from Savannah through a country presenting nothing but interminable swamps and pathless bottom lands, with rank overgrowths of jungle, was arriving at the scene of action breathless, footsore, and faint with hunger. It had been a terrible race. Some regiments had lost a third of their number from fatigue, the men dropping from the ranks as if shot, and left to recover or die at their leisure. Nor was the scene to which they had been invited likely to inspire the moral confidence that medicines physical fatigue. True, the air was full of thunder, and the earth was trembling beneath their feet, and if there is truth in the theory of the conversion of force, these men were storing up energy from every shock that burst its waves upon their bodies. Perhaps this theory may better than another explain the tremendous endurance of men in battle. but the eyes reported only matter for despair. Before us ran the turbulent river, vexed with plunging shells and obscured in spots by blue sheets of low-lying smoke. The two little steamers were doing their duty well. They came over to us empty and went back crowded, sitting very low in the water, apparently on the point of capsizing. The farther edge of the water could not be seen. The boats came out of the obscurity, took on their passengers, and vanished in the darkness. But on the heights above, the battle was burning brightly enough. 1,000 lights kindled and expired in every second of time. There were broad flushings in the sky, against which the branches of the trees showed black. Sudden flames burst out here and there, singly and in dozens. Fleeting streaks of fire crossed over to us by way of welcome. These expired in blinding flashes and fierce little rolls of smoke, attended with a peculiar metallic ring of bursting shells, and followed by the musical humming of the fragments as they struck into the ground on every side, making us wince, but doing little harm. The air was full of noises. To the right and the left the musketry rattled smartly and petulantly. Directly in front it sighed and growled. To the experienced ear this meant that the death line was an arc of which the river was the chord. There were deep, shaking explosions and smart shocks, the whisper of stray bullets and the hurtle of conical shells, the rush of round shot. There were faint, desultory cheers, such as announce a momentary or partial triumph. Occasionally, against the glare behind the trees, could be seen moving black figures, singularly distinct, but apparently no longer than a thumb. They seemed to me ludicrously like the figures of demons in old allegorical prints of hell. To destroy these and all their belongings, the enemy needed but another hour of daylight. The steamers in that case would have been doing him fine service by bringing more fish to his net. Those of us who had the good fortune to arrive late could then have eaten our teeth in impotent rage. Nay, to make his victory sure, it did not need that the sun should pause in the heavens. One of the many random shots falling into the river would have done the business, had chance directed it into the engine-room of a steamer. You can perhaps fancy the anxiety with which we watched them leaping down. But we had two other allies besides the night. Just where the enemy had pushed his right flank to the river was the mouth of a wide bayou, and here 2 gunboats had taken station. They too were of the toy sort, plated perhaps with railway metals, perhaps with boiler iron. They staggered under a heavy gun or two each. The bayou made an opening in the high bank of the river. The bank was a parapet, behind which the gunboats crouched, firing up the bayou as through an embrasure. The enemy was at this disadvantage. He could not get at the gunboats, and he could advance only by exposing his flank to their ponderous missiles, one of which would have broken a half-mile of his bones and made nothing of it. Very annoying this must have been, these 20 gunners beating back an army because a sluggish creek had been pleased to fall into a river at one point rather than another. Such is the part that accident may play in the game of war. As a spectacle this was rather fine. We could just discern the black bodies of these boats, looking very much like turtles. But when they let off their big guns, there was a conflagration. The river shuddered in its banks, and hurried on, bloody, wounded, terrified. Objects a mile away sprang toward our eyes as a snake strikes at the face of its victim. The report stung us to the brain, but we blessed it audibly. Then we could hear the great shell tearing away through the air until the sound died out in the distance. Then, a surprisingly long time afterward, a dull, distant explosion, and a sudden silence of small arms told their own tale. 4. There was, I remember, no elephant on the boat that passed us across that evening, nor, I think, any hippopotamus. These would have been out of place. We had, however, a woman. Whether the baby was somewhere on board I did not learn. She was a fine creature, this woman, somebody's wife. Her mission, as she understood it, was to inspire the failing heart with courage, and when she selected mine, I felt less flattered by her preference than astonished by her penetration. How did she learn? She stood on the upper deck with the red blaze of battle bathing her beautiful face, the twinkle of 1,000 rifles mirrored in her eyes, and displaying a small ivory-handled pistol. She told me in a sentence punctuated by the thunder of great guns that if it came to the worst, she would do her duty like a man. I am proud to remember that I took off my hat to this little fool. 5. Along the sheltered strip of beach between the river bank and the water was a confused mass of humanity, several thousands of men. They were mostly unarmed. Many were wounded, some dead. All the camp-following tribes were there, all the cowards, a few officers. Not one of them knew where his regiment was, nor if he had a regiment. Many had not. These men were defeated, beaten, cowed. They were deaf to duty and dead to shame. A more demented crew never drifted to the rear of broken battalions. They would have stood in their tracks and been shot down to a man by a provost marshal's guard, but they could not have been urged up that bank. An army's bravest men are its cowards. The death which they would not meet at the hands of the enemy, they will meet at the hands of their officers, with never a flinching. Whenever a steamboat would land, this abominable mob had to be kept off her with bayonets. When she pulled away, they sprang on her and were pushed by scores into the water, where they were suffered to drown one another in their own way. The men disembarking insulted them, shoved them, struck them. In return they expressed their unholy delight in the certainty of our destruction by the enemy. By the time my regiment had reached the plateau, night had put an end to the struggle. A sputter of rifles would break out now and then, followed perhaps by a spiritless hurrah. Occasionally a shell from a faraway battery would come pitching down somewhere near, with a whir crescendo, or flit above our heads with a whisper like that made by the wings of a night bird, to smother itself in the river. But there was no more fighting. The gunboats, however, blazed away at set intervals all night long, just to make the enemy uncomfortable and break him of his rest. For us there was no rest. Foot by foot we moved through the dusky fields, we knew not whither. There were men all about us, but no campfires. To have made a blaze would have been madness. The men were of strange regiments. They mentioned the names of unknown generals. They gathered in groups by the wayside. They recounted the depressing incidents of the day. A thoughtful officer shut their mouths with a sharp word as he passed. A wise one coming after encouraged them to repeat their doleful tale all along the line. Hidden in hollows and behind clumps of rank brambles were large tents, dimly lighted with candles, but looking comfortable. The kind of comfort they supplied was indicated by pairs of men entering and reappearing, bearing litters, by low moans from within, and by long rows of dead with covered faces outside. These tents were constantly receiving the wounded. yet were never full. They were continually ejecting the dead, yet were never empty. It was as if the helpless had been carried in and murdered, that they might not hamper those whose business it was to fall tomorrow. The night was now black dark. As is usual after a battle, it had begun to rain. Still we moved. We were being put into position by somebody. Inch by inch we crept along, treading on one another's heels by way of keeping together. Commands were passed along the line in whispers. More commonly, none were given. When the men had pressed so closely together that they could advance no farther, they stood stock still, sheltering the locks of their rifles with their ponchos. In this position, many fell asleep. When those in front suddenly stepped away, those in the rear, roused by the tramping, hastened after with such zeal that the line was soon choked again. Evidently the head of the division was being piloted at a snail's pace by someone who did not feel sure of his ground. Very often we struck our feet against the dead, more frequently against those who still had spirit enough to resent it with a moan. These were lifted carefully to one side and abandoned. Some had sense enough to ask in their weak way for water. Absurd. Their clothes were soaken, their hair dank, their white faces, dimly discernible, were clammy and cold. Besides, none of us had any water. There was plenty coming, though, for before midnight a thunderstorm broke upon us with great violence. The rain, which had for hours been a dull drizzle, fell with a copiousness that stifled us. We moved in running water up to our ankles. Happily, we were in a forest of great trees heavily decorated with Spanish moss, or with an enemy standing to his guns, the disclosures of the lightning might have been inconvenient. As it was, the incessant blaze enabled us to consult our watches and encouraged us by displaying our numbers. Our black, sinuous line, creeping like a giant serpent beneath the trees, was apparently interminable. I am almost ashamed to say how sweet I found the companionship of those coarse men. So the long night wore away, and, as the glimmer of morning crept in through the forest, we found ourselves in a more open country. But where? Not a sign of battle was here. The trees were neither splintered nor scarred, the underbrush was unmown, the ground had no footprints but our own. It was as if we had broken into glades sacred to eternal silence. I should not have been surprised to see sleek leopards come fawning about our feet, and milk-white deer confront us with human eyes. A few inaudible commands from an invisible leader had placed us in order of battle. But where was the enemy? Where, too, were the riddled regiments that we had come to save? Had our other divisions arrived during the night and passed the river to assist us? Or were we to oppose our paltry 5,000 breasts to an army flushed with victory? What protected our right? Who lay upon our left? Was there really anything in our front? There came, borne to us on the raw morning air, the long, weird note of a bugle. It was directly before us. It rose with a low, clear, deliberate warble, and seemed to float in the gray sky like the note of a lark. The bugle calls of the Federal and the Confederate armies were the same. It was the assembly. As it died away, I observed that the atmosphere had suffered a change. Despite the equilibrium established by the storm, it was electric. Wings were growing on blistered feet. Bruised muscles and jolted bones, shoulders pounded by the cruel knapsack, eyelids leaden from lack of sleep. All were pervaded by the subtle fluid. All were unconscious of their clay. The men thrust forward their heads, expanded their eyes, and clenched their teeth. They breathed hard, as if throttled by tugging at the leash. If you had laid your hand in the beard or hair of one of these men, it would have crackled and shot sparks. Continued in Part 2.